Hey everybody, today I'm going to break down one of my favorite books of all time, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. If you haven't read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People before, this is definitely a great video to kind of get a good overview and the ideas that are being presented in the book before you delve deep into it. And I would highly recommend that after watching these videos you go ahead and pick up a copy. If you have already read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I would recommend watching this video and keep going through it, because my hope is that you will also have a refresher of the ideas and concepts that are presented by Stephen R. Covey without having to go back and read through the entire book. So without further ado, here's our breakdown of 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. To really understand any kind of book, you have to understand how it is broken down. Now obviously, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is broken down into 7 habits which we may live by. But it's also broken down into 3 main components. And those 3 components are independence, interdependence, and development. The very first section, like I just mentioned, is independence. Now this concept is pretty well understood by most of us, I would say. When we're young, we are very dependent upon our parents for the things that we need every day. But as we grow older, we need to become more independent and more reliant on ourselves. Independence means more than just being able to take care of yourself. It also means that you take responsibility for your own actions. One of the biggest ideas regarding 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is this idea of changing the world around us. And one of the first things that Stephen R. Covey suggests is that before we can change the world, we have to change ourselves. So the first 3 habits are primarily centered around how can we change our own selves, our own environment, or our own viewpoint of the world so that we can go out and actually help change the world in of itself. The next section, which is probably a little less obvious and less talked about, is the concept of interdependence. Now, just how independence is us being dependent upon ourselves, interdependence is kind of a combination of dependence and independence, but a little bit more complicated than that. Interdependence is essentially the idea that I rely upon you for one thing and you also rely upon me for another thing. Essentially, it's the kind of ideas like we have each other's backs. The best example of interdependence is more of like an ecosystem kind of idea. If you think about like a forest or an ocean's kind of environment, neither species directly may ever need to rely upon another species for living. They obviously go out and they hunt for themselves and they provide for their own needs. However, one species may rely upon maybe a certain berry of some kind, and therefore it relies upon another species for how they fertilize the ground in keeping those plants alive. What I like about this concept is it actually really takes away from this self-centered idea about self-reliance. I obviously believe that we should go and we should be providing for ourselves, but in a lot of ways we don't actually are completely self-reliant. To give you an idea, look at the clothes that you're wearing right now as you're watching this video, or the computer that you're watching this on. Did you create either of those things? Did you sew your clothes? Did you put the components of your computer together? The answer is most likely not at all. So therefore, the idea that we can never be completely self-reliant is kind of a selfish, self-absorbed concept. We are never truly reliant just upon ourselves, but rather we can be contributing members to society or as groups as a whole. The third and last section of which 7 Habits of Highly Effective People cover is the idea of development. Now, as Stephen R. Covey goes through the book, he kind of emphasizes very important aspects of our lives. Those aspects that he's talking about are such things like our family, our social life, our health, and all these things require specific care and attention to be taken care of. The idea of this third section is that we are taking care of these different aspects of our lives from a personal perspective, a family perspective, a community, and a world perspective. So now that we've kind of gone over a general idea of the structure of this book, let's kind of delve into like those details, more specifically the actual 7 habits of highly effective people. Habit number 1 is being proactive. Essentially, being proactive is the idea that you have control over something in your life. The opposite of being proactive is to be reactive, in which that outside circumstances will affect us and therefore then we respond to that action outside. So how do we be proactive? One way we can be proactive is instead of waiting for someone to tell us to do something or waiting to have some event to occur in our lives, we essentially take action right now to do whatever we can in that moment. This usually is an assessment of what do we have control over. We obviously don't have control over other people, but we do have control over ourselves and our actions, which is why being proactive is such a powerful principle talked about in the 7 Habits. In fact, actually, unless we are proactive, we won't even be able to have any kind of foundation in which to build upon these other habits with. The second habit is to put first things first. Now, when I first read this part of the book, I literally found myself in tears of the description that Stephen was starting to portray in this. And it wasn't even that it was like this deep, allegorical, mysterious substance out there kind of thing, which I'm not even making sense of what I'm talking about here, am I? Rather, what it was this example of this imaginary experience of walking into your funeral and listening to people speaking about yourself. And what I got from reading this very close moment was that when at the end of our lives, what is it that is going to be important, so important to us that we will be taking action on right now? So often, I think we get caught up in the moment of what matters to us in this moment without actually having the perspective of what's going to matter to us 20 years down the road. Now, obviously, we can't have vivid detail regarding what we want our lives to be, but we can have at least a close understanding of what is the ultimate end goal of our lives, of our organizations, to achieve. Essentially, it is when we begin with this end in mind that our day-to-day actions actually have importance. And we'll actually find ourselves taking out things and putting things into our lives that will matter more and lead more to this end goal that we have in mind. Which leads into the third habit, which is to put first things first. Now, this habit seems kind of like weird in some ways, because of course we would put first things first, right? But I think what Covey kind of sees here and what he's trying to get at in this habit is that oftentimes we kind of screw up our priorities. And there are many different ideas and ways in which we can kind of narrow down our priorities, but that's not the concept in which Covey is trying to illustrate here. Covey is really trying to get at in these concepts of what he delves into putting first things first is simply that whatever is our top priority, whatever that might be, that we don't allow it to be at mercy to the things that matter least. In this section of the book, Covey actually has a diagram in which he illustrates kind of the things that often, which are most important, often do kind of fall to the things that matter least. All things pretty much fall into 4 different categories. Things that are important and urgent, things that are not important and not urgent, things that are important but not urgent, and things that are urgent and not important. Interestingly enough, we might think that the important and urgent things are where we should spend most of our time, or where we should be thinking about a lot. Rather, what actually Covey recommends here is not that to spend our time in urgent matters, but the things that are important but are not urgent. These can be things like reading, exercising, picking up the phone and calling an old friend, writing a letter, sending an email, anything. Those deep relationships or ideas or practices that are ultimately going to affect our lives more in the long run, but aren't necessarily things that are urgent right now. As you may have noticed, these last 3 habits were part of that first part in which we talked about that these habits are really centered on being independent upon yourself and being able to do things on your own. And I guess even more than that, not just doing things on your own, but of thinking on your own and doing things on a higher level. Those first 3 habits are essentially the changing yourself first before you can go out and actually change everything else. The next 3 habits we're going to talk to are part of that second section in which we talk about being interdependent, relying on each other and working with one another to accomplish tasks. The 4th habit, which we're going to talk about, is thinking win-win. Now, in some ways, I actually haven't quite always understood this habit as much as I would like to say I could have. The general idea of thinking win-win is that we're moving away from this idea that if I'm winning, someone is losing. And if someone else is winning, then obviously I must be losing. Essentially, the concept of win-win is that we create situations in which all people can be satisfied with the results. Now, win-win situations aren't compromises. A compromise is essentially, well, I'll give up this if you give up this. But a win-win situation is more of coming to a better conclusion than either of you could come to on your own. And this actually kind of really builds upon and is an extension of the 5th habit, which is first seek to understand before seeking to be understood. Now, this habit is quite self-explanatory. Essentially, it is, instead of trying to convince people of your ideas and what you're thinking, Try to understand how other people are thinking and other people's point of view. Probably at one point had heard the whine of, "You don't understand me!" And that truly comes from, honestly, a lack of understanding on both parts. We actually tried to listen and to understand people before we tried to give them the information or give them the ideas or the programs or whatever it is that we're trying to do, we would find that maybe our ideas aren't as great as we thought they would be, or perhaps we could even solve their questions with the solutions that we're coming up with. Or maybe there's details about our ideas that we need to fix that are completely wrong. And honestly, being wrong is okay. Something that I've been learning quite recently. Which kind of then lumps itself up into the sixth habit, which is to synergize. To synergize essentially means is that the sum total is greater than the sum of its parts, which sounds kind of convoluted and doesn't make sense when you try to say it out loud, but if it makes sense. Think about a man and a woman. 1 + 1 = 2, right? Well, if you have a man and a woman and they have a baby, 1 + 1 = 3. Maybe even 4, 5, 12, depending upon how crazy you might be getting. Same goes for with people and solving problems. When we come together and we try to get things, I guess, moving forward in a direction, the sum total of what we all can do together is going to be much greater than what we could do alone. The very last habit that Stephen R. Covey talks about is the principle of sharpening the saw. Essentially, the best way to describe this idea is, imagine you are going out and you're going to go chop down a tree, whether with a saw or an axe, I guess it doesn't really matter. And you're out there and you're hacking away or sawing away at this tree, and you eventually get to a point where the saw or the axe starts to wear down and becomes dull. Now, if you want to make this process faster, you would be willing to take the time to sharpen your saw or your axe so that you could chop down that tree even faster with less effort. Similarly, there are activities in our lives, whether that's in our community or by ourselves, with our family, in which we are sharpening the tools that we have to basically be more effective. There are many different areas of our life that need to be, I guess, sharpened. One, spiritual, physically, emotionally, mentally, socially. All these different aspects of our lives need care and attention. Often in our very busy lives, we kind of can lose track of making sure that we take care of such things. Sharpening the saw kind of goes back to the principle in habit 2 and habit 3 of putting first things first. It's very easy to overlook such habits as reading and writing and calling family members on the phone, cleaning your house so it doesn't become an utter mess. So rather than letting all these different aspects of our lives begin to run dry and feel kind of empty, it is important that we regularly schedule time in our day and throughout our week to sharpen our saws, you could say. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People has definitely been the most influential book in my life. And I can say anytime that I go back and I reread or I rethink about these principles we just talked about, I really can see the value that I may be missing in by not applying these habits in my life. Ultimately, what I love about this book is it's not just this huge list of you need to do this, you need to do that, don't do this, don't avoid this, but rather it's a book about learning true principles and applying those principles into our lives. At the end of Stephen R. Covey's book, he kind of describes the real purpose of his book. That it really wasn't just about changing our outer character, but really about changing the very person that we are being. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. I hope to be doing more of these kinds of videos about breaking down different books that I've read and really talking about the context in this book. I realize that some people don't always have the time to read or to read as many books as they would like, and my hope is that by doing these videos I can give you an opportunity to expand your ideas and knowledge of the contents of some great books that are out there. If you like this video, please subscribe on that big red button below, and I look forward to seeing you guys again. Thank you.